Simplement vous informer que this session is available in English and French. To access the French and English interpretation, you will see a globe at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that globe, you can switch between French and English. Cette session est disponible en anglais et en français. Pour accéder à l'interprétation en français et en anglais, vous verrez un globe en bas de votre écran. Si vous cliquez sur ce globe, vous pouvez basculer entre le français et l'anglais. Quelques petits rappels techniques, bien que nous soyons très habitués depuis le mois de mars dernier avec les technologies. Je veux simplement vous rappeler que vous pouvez nous voir, nous entendre, mais nous, on ne peut pas vous voir malheureusement, ni vous entendre. Alors, si vous avez des questions tout au long de la session, veuillez les insérer dans la boîte de chat. Nous allons intégrer vos questions dans la discussion plus tard dans cette session et les publierons les réponses dans le chat. Cette session est enregistrée et pourra être consultée sur le site web de Fondation communautaire du Canada après la session. J'aimerais mentionner que, comme j'habite la grande région de Québec, nous sommes présentement sur le territoire autochtone des Hurons-Wendat. Ceci étant dit, nous allons regarder maintenant un aperçu de l'initiative des collectivités en santé. Donc, l'initiative pour des collectivités en santé est un investissement de 31 millions de dollars du gouvernement du Canada pour aider les collectivités à créer et adapter les espaces publics afin de répondre aux nouvelles réalités de la COVID-19. Le financement peut être utilisé pour adapter les espaces publics ou des programmes ou des services qui répondent à la COVID-19 et qui servent le public ou une communauté touchée de façon disproportionnée par la COVID-19. Les organismes sont invités à faire participer la collectivité à la conception de leur projet. En offrant un financement entre 5 000 et 250 000 $, l'initiative pour des collectivités en santé vise à soutenir les efforts locaux en vue de développer des solutions d'infrastructure à petite échelle, des programmes ou des services pour les collectivités aux 4 coins du Canada. Les organismes peuvent déposer une demande dès maintenant jusqu'au 9 mars 2021 à 17 h, heure normale du Pacifique. Visitez initiative pour des collectivités en santé.ca afin de savoir comment déposer une demande.
In order to learn how to file an application and a second cycle for this initiative will start in May 2021. And over the next few days, our partners will be hosting community engagement sessions where you can learn more about the program themes, get inspired by project examples, and ask for advice on how to get your project off the ground. All sessions will be held with simultaneous interpretation in French and in English by using the globe at the bottom of the screen. Now, today's session, organized by Living in the City, focuses on creating safe and vibrant public spaces and improving mobility options, also called Vivre en Ville. There are many steps that communities can take to create safe and vibrant public spaces and improve mobility options. Today, you will discover some of these practical project opportunities in times of pandemic and beyond, and learn the basic concepts for anchoring innovative projects in your community. Without further ado, over to you, Catherine. Thank you. Thank you very much, Claude. As mentioned, Jean-Philippe, my colleague, and myself are here today on behalf of Vivre en Ville. We are a public interest organization working everywhere in Quebec for the development of viable communities, and our skills are varied, as you can see here. And we have offices in Quebec, Montreal, and Gatineau. Jean-Philippe, you can change slides. As mentioned, the initiative holds 3 themes, and we will focus on the first 2 that you see on your screen: creating safe and vibrant public spaces and improving mobility options, among other things, because this is our strength. And you may move to the next slide. We're going to start by talking about safe and vibrant public spaces. And just a slight reminder, there's a great deal of information, among which the applicant's guide, which is available on the CHCI website. And I recommend you refer to it to check the eligibility of your projects. But today, our work is to mobilize all of this, show you the projects, and we'll conclude our session today by showing you a sort of reminder, a memory jogger of points to remember, to not forget, in order to go ahead and succeed with such projects. And if you want to change slides, Jean-Philippe, thank you. And the first public space, and we want you to bear this in mind during our presentation. Everything we'll try to present today has to do with public space. And this also includes streets. This is one of our topics that we focus on. So to have that idea of what we're presenting today, focus on this, where there's a great deal of potential actions that can be taken, which are referred to as public spaces. And the second major theme to bear in mind, we're doing this within the idea of placemaking. So the concept of a process related to co-creation, and it appropriates, reappropriates public spaces by communities and to their image. So this idea, and of course, please forgive the fact that it's not very appetizing when looking at this slide. It's in both French and English. And this is the idea of a project, a traditional project management illustration, which includes the diagnosis with the community. And so I leave you with these two ideas, and we'll move to the next slide. Now, to give you an overview or to sort of stimulate your appetite, later in the second part of our presentation, we're going to show you more information and examples. There are many, many tools online, and we're going to list URL links, sources for you to have access to memory joggers similar to this loop, which is also available in English. It's about projects and public spaces and safe and vibrant public spaces. We want you to bear this in mind in terms of public spaces, and certainly there are others that fit your reality, but just to bear this in mind, and we're going to get back to that, but they're very good ideas and memory joggers or reminders that you may consult after our session. And Jean-Philippe, over to you now. Yes, thank you, Catherine, and thank you for that introduction. We'll immediately delve into our subject matter with the presentation of transitional project examples in terms of public spaces. And so the the designs we can adopt for public spaces to meet the new, well, not necessarily the new challenges, but the challenges brought on by the pandemic finally. And not that it offers us, but the one, I mean, rather challenges we have to overcome that we're confronted with in order to appropriate public spaces. Briefly together, we have a first cycle, which is reappropriation of a church landing, if you will. And this is an example of an initiative that was held in Quebec City. And so the first one is the famous church landing that we have adopted in many of our neighborhoods. Our neighborhoods were built around parishes. To give you another example, here in Quebec City, a second brief example, we were referring to the Saint-Jean-Baptiste, Saint John the Baptist Church in Quebec City. You must know when working with parishes, with churches, there are several challenges, and we'll be able to address that a little later on in our presentation. But I want to show you the various types of projects possible in public spaces, among which church landings. The second type of project to inspire you, and so this is another type of public space, the famous back alleys. And so there are various programs in various cities in order to provide greenery to our back lanes or alleys. Not all cities have this type of project or this type of layout or design, urban design, but the the back lane or the alleyway brings together the renters, the landlords, in order to reappropriate this public space to socialize And so this is another way to appropriate a public space. Another example, of course, we reappropriated an urban space, and this is a very good example. Au Pied du Courant, it's a village, and we appropriated a parking lot. In fact, it was a former snow depot near the St. Lawrence River and under the Jacques Cartier Bridge, and that was recently turned into a sort of urban beach. And this is a wonderful idea. And so this is a public space that can be exploited in order to reappropriate a public space. Furthermore, in times of pandemic, another example to assist you, even for those in the region of Montreal, there are organizations that gave themselves the mission of helping out citizens, organizations to reappropriate public spaces and also to map out certain events. And so this is Land, which is mainly active in Montreal. Other examples for public space appropriation, of course, this can be done by way of urban gardens to feed the population. And often these are integrated in other public space projects. And these projects live on their own, basically. They're self-sufficient. So the entire concept of the urban garden, community garden, and to feed the neighborhood is an interesting and fun way to appropriate public space. And of course, in our examples, there was that fresco, that mural, which is also a public space appropriation to encourage urban art. Let's not hesitate to be creative when proposing projects, of course. And another very important component when referring to public space, it is the appropriation of the seasons and more specifically the winter time in our day-to-day. As currently, this is an example of a winter lab that was developed by Vivre en Ville and the Main Street Nursery in order to reconsider our connection, our relationship with the seasons, the winter in our day-to-day, and how to appropriate winter via playtime, games, and how to appropriate the winter time in our everyday uh, activities. And to also join this, we have warm and cozy stations in the city of Quebec. We did this winter, and in Montreal, something similar was set in place. These are winter stations, and this was public and involved architecture, which is also an option for the presentation of projects for the current project application. Another way to appropriate public space is via value, adding value to places that are underused. Example, there's a library in Quebec City, and in front of another library in Quebec City, here's another example. Anything that can be valued, that can be reused, and to also get the tools to add value to public spaces already present or forthcoming. And of course, this is transitory for public spaces. Then we're going to slowly move to the streets. So active mobility with this series of examples, other examples of public space appropriation to make a main street more valuable. And this is an example in Quebec City in the Limoilou neighborhood. And this is Third Avenue, which is a very important main street. And we set in place a public space project with measures to enhance active mobility, in fact, on the street. And so this is tied to the second part of my presentation of sorts. And this is the project that was proposed in as a temporary project, a transitory project, in order to eventually provide ideas to a permanent project, which was inaugurated a few years ago. So truly, we gathered all the ideas and enabled this project to become one that was structural and appropriating public space. Another a transient appropriation of a public space and to value a main street. And so this is Placette Cartier in Quebec City. And there's also Saint-Sauveur Placette on Saint-Vallier Street. And these are small projects, small scale interventions, but to enhance one's day to day, to show the different sequences on a main street. And these projects are not huge, but they could be very well structural permanently and valued on a main street. Other examples here, this one is in Campbellton in New Brunswick on Andrew Street. And the citizens within this municipality got together in order to redesign the street to traffic, and this is a wonderful idea. Another example of a public space where we can take action and be active. This was a parking lot, a surface parking lot, with this example from Saint-Vallier Oasis in Quebec City and Saint-Vallier Promenade. This is an example in Quebec City. There are several examples in other cities, such as Montreal. Even Montreal produced a guide on how to set in place this type of design in a public space in order to take more room on the public space and streets. This takes me to the second part of my presentation. So we've just provided examples in terms of public space, but public space also includes the streets. So we're going to move to a second tier to this project that you may apply on. And so this is to enhance active mobility in times of a pandemic, to enable uh, pedestrians, cyclists, the more vulnerable populations to better also explore the streets or transportation and mobility options. This is an example. This is a transient project on a public space, which is the street, in order to improve active mobility. This is an example of a current street. And so we have a wide lane and then also the pavement and sidewalks that aren't not wide enough to comply with physical distancing, that of 2 meters in a safe manner for all users. And then this is a main street or a portion of a main street ideal for active mobility. In other words, we've reduced to a minimum the space for cars or automobiles in order to enhance active mobility in terms of sidewalks, and will propose an elevated intersection to grant priority and also to facilitate uh, the mobility for pedestrians and cyclists. And when referring to transient projects or designs, they're simple, effective, and rapid ways to take action to show that this type of change is possible in public spaces. And we're talking about temporary sidewalks and planters, markers, or temporary pop-up bike paths. And these we will use to make changes in public spaces in order to support and favor active mobility, pedestrians and cyclists. And we'll see these measures briefly in a few moments in the following slides. Therefore, as I said, transitional measures enable us to act fast and to test for the future. And I place a great deal of emphasis on test for the future. The second point, yes, of course, we need to act fast, but this may also serve for future reflection and consideration. So test for the future for these installations to become permanent. And next, of course, we have if we have a transitional process, we'll have to test it over time, over one season or several seasons, to eventually have the project materialize. This is Marquette Street in Quebec City, where we implemented certain traffic measures to slow down car traffic and to enhance cycling and walking. To bear in mind, we must imagine interventions that could be more artisanal or that can use the means available within your communities that are available locally. And when I say this, in Canada, we are a country where we have the winter. Why not use it? And another suggestion we can do is to use snow to show that the available space for pedestrians and all of the space available, in fact, for pedestrians and cyclists on the street, but which finally is somewhat underused. And this is an example right here where you see several public spaces that are snowed in but can be used. And so examples of transitional measures quickly, as I said, we spoke of temporary elevated sidewalks, and these temporary elevated sidewalks, we have an example on Argyle Street in Halifax, a very interesting project where we've set in place sidewalks. They're elevated sidewalks with very simple means, wood and pavers that were already available in the municipal depot or garage to leave space for pedestrians and rework the main street. Next, also to use bollards and markings. And these are so simple to put in place and very effective on the street. And so here we have an idea of a street plan with the markings on the ground and bollards. And of course, markings work better in the summer, but we have to bear in mind that we have to hang on to these bollards or the concrete blocks. And in the winter as well, we'll see another example. And so we have to integrate these, well, in the city snow removal plans, but we have to do this ahead of time. And so this is another example of a transitional projects with bollards and concrete blocks and markings again on Milton in Montreal. Another example I find to be interesting in terms of Calgary, they themselves develop, we're going to talk about this a little more, but concrete blocks in terms of public works, I mean, directly internally and with engineering. They obtain these in order to be in a position to create spaces to show that all of the space can be granted to pedestrians and cyclists in these streets, and not just on main streets, but also on suburban streets. And we'll see that a little later on. In terms of bollards, it could be very simple to set up bollards. Very, very simple. Look at this, of the utmost simplicity, but very effective. And then vegetation bins or planters. And so, yes, I mean, we want to use the space for vegetation and for pedestrians, cyclists. And so these are vegetation bins that are highly effective, and they can easily be deployed on our streets and sidewalks. And those were examples. And now that we've seen examples and measures that may quickly apply in public spaces, we'll move on to important and significant projects that show, in my opinion, that it may be possible to make these changes very rapidly, very quickly. I spoke of Argyle Street in Halifax. Well, this is the sidewalk before the intervention, and now the sidewalk during the phase, the transitional phase, wherein we tested and illustrated, showed to the population and the citizens what the outcome might be if we widened the sidewalk. And this is the final result, the permanent result of this project on Argyle Street. So we are capable of using various measures, and these transitional measures can really be used for a permanent project afterwards on a main street or on a side street. We'll see that a little later on. And this is the avenue, the Shamrock Avenue project in Montreal before, when it was in transition, and then we added the bollards and markings on the ground. And Also, we took up an entire traffic lane. Oh, I forgot this one. This is the famous carousel. And this is one of the projects that had been set up on Shamrock Street in Montreal. And finally, we headed towards a permanent and after permanent project that leaves a great deal of space to pedestrians and cyclists as well. Now, I want to get back to the famous example of Calgary that I found to be greatly interesting because this was the fruit of internal labor with city folks, where we developed and used concrete blocks aimed at showing all the space we can give pedestrians and cyclists on the street. And I spoke of a suburban example. Here it is. This is Child Avenue. We can see this is a residential district and neighborhood in a suburb wherein the space was very much dedicated to automobiles. And here we can show to what extent we can take space for pedestrians, cyclists, but also for future vegetation and to yield a permanent project that gives back space and to make this street far more safer. The intersection I've just shown you was greatly at high risk because it was far too wide and poorly positioned. Same thing. So Calgary again will use these blocks to reinvent, redesign intersections that present a high risk on high traffic boulevards to see if we can create certain uh, islands of refuge or shoulders, if we can use these. And finally, an example in Three Rivers this summer, and an example of concrete blocks that were available that were made available by the municipality to create pedestrian streets or to close certain streets. So often the materials or the measures are already available in our municipalities. We need only take the time to deploy them and also to have the courage to set them in place. And often we already have these materials on hand. Therefore, yes, 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 yes. I'm at the point where I have to hand over the mic to Catherine to also tie everything into a toolkit and also to give Jean-Philippe the opportunity to take a sip of water while he works the slides for me. We saw plenty of examples. We're talking about public spaces. Right now, we're talking about streets, and we have slides for which perhaps you're a little more interested. You can take a screenshot, but yes, in the chat earlier, we know that we're being recorded currently and you'll have access to this content thereafter, but I draw your attention to this page. This is the information in French, and I will take a moment to mention that there are items on streets on how to collect data to then ponder and reflect on how to assess your project. Jean-Philippe will get back to that. And there are things on streets and sidewalks. We try to list these ideas, these examples, while bearing in mind that not all of this will necessarily be available and accessible because these guides were not prepared for the current funding guide, but these are English resources. You can see Streets for Pandemic and also rapid placemaking. These are specific documents for COVID times. And so their ideas to fetch here, they're memory joggers, reminders to help you. And so we'll provide you with the hyperlink or the URL so you may consult them afterwards. Next slide. Jean-Philippe spoke about this just a glance. The winter time is a season in itself. And some people have asked themselves the question, pondered on this. And so, yes, of course, in French, we have ville d'hiver, and in English, For example, in Edmonton, you have access to a start of reflection. I mean, you can start to consider how to address the winter differently. Next slide. Now, we said that we wouldn't talk about digital resources. That's really not our strong suit, but this is an example. It's an idea you may use to ponder and reflect. This is a library that is online. It's an online library to obtain models. For example, if you here we have a ramp, but there are several examples of models here that you can download and you can then print or cut out or build in your areas, in your environment. And we want to share it nonetheless because it might inspire you for your projects at home. And everything is accessible online at Better Block. And the next slide for me before I turn it over to Jean-Philippe just for, I'm going to try to crunch all of this info. What must we consider when considering such a project, whatever you're thinking about now? But in the applicant's guide in both French and English, there's a guide on equity. And this one will propose, it was written up by Jay Pitter, and it proposes certain some wording on how to think, how to address equity for your project. And often we're short of time because there's a great deal of info available. But remember that there is several tools available to you to dig deeper for your blind spots or special areas of interest. And this is a sort of thesis on how to subdivide your projects. And Jean-Philippe, over to you. And for the momentous point, yes, we saw examples of public spaces. We saw how to appropriate, reappropriate active mobility. But, and we've just seen several references. You will have access to the presentation and you'll be able to revisit, in fact, all of the examples just presented a moment ago. For the third part of our presentation, we are asking ourselves the question, how to unroll a project, how to start it up, and what process is involved. And of course, this is a process we propose. And the process we propose here is rapidly presented. You may adopt another if you wish, but in our opinion, there are three steps to a transitional project. And these steps are fairly interesting and cover pretty much everything that has to be considered. I will start and delve into it immediately. And so it's a three-step process. Number one, participatory design, then transitional project, and then collective activity. And just before engaging into these three steps, we might ask which are the human resources required for these three steps I will present for a project. And I found this question to be highly important. We must first think of a project lead. If you want to set up a project, especially a transitional project, whether it be in a public space or to improve active mobility on a main street or a neighborhood street, think of the person who will lead the project, whether it be somebody within your organization or one within your municipality. And you must sort of set up a work cell or community or team. And then the second key is to have an agent, or if possible, to have a team, a mobilization agent or team in the field. These are the most important people of your projects because they're going to be present on the site and they will personify, they will tailor, customize your project out in the field. And so if you must start up a project from now to tomorrow morning, think of two key people to lead the project, or a team, or at the very least, a mobilization agent out in the field. Therefore, we'll delve into our first step. And so the way we'll proceed quickly, I will present the various steps and the various components, which in our opinion are key to set up this transitional type project. Firstly, Now, within participatory uh, involvement, before setting up a project, you must consider it, think it out, and you must set up also ideation activity and community mobilization. In other words, what should we do? And it could take the form uh, of a round table, coffee table, meeting discussion. But being on the site really enables you to better impregnate the issues and challenges on the site and to mobilize the citizens within their environment or right next door to their place. And so every time you'll see a blue medallion, will give you a cue on who must take care of this step. And of course, it will be the project lead and the mobilization agent or team in the field. Next, the second aspect referring to mobilization, we must mobilize continuously. So, yes, of course, we must set in place ideation before conceiving or even thinking the project. But throughout the project, we must question it and it must be done continuously. It's about continuous mobilization. And so we have examples of sites. And of course, after going through ideation or holding participatory workshops with the citizens or the people involved, then we move to concept development. If we must take action in a public space, especially if we must take action on the street, one must minimally design something. Therefore, the the design concept can be done by a local urban design firm, or if you're a municipality, you might have internal design services, engineering services, or if you're a nonprofit organization, you may have access to certain resources or services. And next, of course, the designs and sketches you will produce could be very simple, but you must be in a position to show and illustrate the idea. And often the image you will create will be the one that you'll be also able to publish within your communications a project to mobilize other organizations or to present to your municipality or other funding agencies if need be in certain respects. And finally, yes, completion of prior plans and specifications for permit approval. This is very important to be able to illustrate and show where things will fit and which will be the measures, exactly where they'll be placed, or at least to give a general idea and view, to be in a position to obtain permits and approvals from municipalities or authorities for which you will have to implement your project. And finally, in terms of the participatory component, there's evaluation and monitoring, continuous project evaluation. You're going to have to measure, in fact, the capacity to change things and the capacity to meet the needs of your mission, to respond to your mission. So evaluate before, during, and after setting up your project. I invite you to take into consideration the reference right here that was held by the Montreal Urban Department, how to collect data on a public space under the form of a questionnaire analysis and a field study. And this can be done through the mobilization team when this was done for public space and the questioning raised. Now, step two, transitional project. Therefore, this is the uh, far more physical and tangible tier of the project. Firstly, the intervention built, and we're talking about manpower here. And so to build a project, you need people who will be capable of achieving this project and try to do so as much as possible with a local team of builders. Perhaps you have builders within your organization. It could be within your community. It could be within public works of the various municipalities. By experience and working with public works and municipalities, this kind of project can provide a great deal of value for public works and will enable to also muster the troops around these projects that are not customary. They stand out of the ordinary, and often they're welcome and without necessarily being solicited. And they could be rudimentary, but of great expertise and call to local talents and community resources, of course. If you have volunteer workers dedicated and really involved in your community, do not hesitate to also use them and to have them participate. Forgive me, looking for my words. So these are examples. And finally, a very important point, and we're greatly relying on resources within the community. But for this type of product, we shouldn't focus just on volunteering. If you have projects or concepts that are a little more elaborate, do not hesitate. And if you can, try to work with people who are slightly more professional for certain components. Otherwise, if these components that you integrated are a little more complex, perhaps you might review them if you don't have the ability or the capability of hiring anybody to build. So you must remain realistic. And finally, in terms of the materials during a built intervention, use local and or recycled materials. And on this, I invite you to contact your municipalities to find out if you can have access to a municipal depot or garage that has these resources that you can maximize. Sometimes there are materials or various types of uh, designs that have been stored there and that are underused. Or at times, you might have access to eco centers, which might prove to be interesting. If you are a municipality, by the way, try to give access uh, to eco centers, to community centers, because sometimes they can set in place certain projects with materials and will be able to use some of these. So this is a possibility. Next, well, use the methods and materials available to you and which are significant to your community. No specific aesthetics to this type of project. Use available materials and methods, those that are available to you, and methods that have significance in your community. And so we're not looking for anything aesthetic necessarily. And in terms of uh, purchases and fixed assets, sometimes in terms of furnishing, furniture, and sometimes these require maintenance, storage based on the season. So you have to bear that in mind. Bear it in mind in terms of your budget when you'll probably require somebody to monitor these or to have a backup plan to be able to replace the light bulbs or a broken chair and to have those in stock and to bear in mind that those mobile assets sometimes will call for more consideration than those included permanently or as a fixed asset, and then disassembling and storage. And so prefer projects requiring little or no disassembling. If you can create this ahead of time with your municipality and you can consider a certain corner within the municipal depot or garage in order to provide you with storage. So establish your contacts and consider this immediately. Think about this step if you need to disassemble or store anything. And Jean-Philippe, I'm certain that you have an eye on the clock, and I know that we're left with a few slides, and it's 1:13. I'll give you a moment to conclude. Yes, you'll have a whole of 15 minutes for the Q&A period. I'm almost done, indeed. And so the third step in our presentation on activation and programming of public space. This step is not at all cost necessary for all project types, but we insisted on presenting it to you because it may prove to be highly interesting and it adds a tier to your project in a public space or on a street. And so set up an open citizen led programming with a call for proposals. And this is really the best way to be able to create a project that will bring people together and that will serve the mission of another organization as well, perhaps, and will enable an organization to acquire visibility and to get known through your project. Next, to also ensure presence on the site on days activities are held and welcoming of visitors. This is the job description of the mobilization agent's day-to-day agenda, if you will. And this is super important. And finally, another role for the mobilization agent in terms of activation and programming is the animation and special event coordination. And if you want to hold this, bear in mind that you'll need your mobilization team to support you to at least organize and and greet the various organizers of events that will take place here. And another important component is to promote local talents. And so, yes, you'll need a budget for local artists, whether it be visual, musical, involving all sorts of performances. This is super important. And the last point, but not least, so, as I said, yes, you have to plan for a budget and you have to plan for resources to hold theme workshops with local organizations. And so, use your project to promote other initiatives and, and to help other organizations who don't necessarily have all the visibility they should have. So, budget for themed workshops. And this concludes my presentation, in fact. And so I'm ready to take questions. We have a whole 14 minutes to take your questions. Yes. Hello. Thank you very much, Jean Philippe and Catherine. This was highly interesting. I have the clear impression that all of our listeners, our observers, truly appreciated your presentation. I would like to activate my camera, but it's impossible for me to do so. It's not all that serious. But this being said, we're going to move to a few questions now. Therefore, Therefore, what are the funding amounts granted? Minimum funding amounts for projects range from $5,000 to $250,000. Several people also asked the question, will this presentation be available after this virtual or online presentation? Yes, on um, the CUI or CHCI, you will find this presentation on CFC as well. So we have other questions as well, but I wish to thank Sally and Jacqueline, who did exceptional work to answer several questions in the chat box. There are several questions, and we will attempt to answer these. And so, what should I plan in my budget? And so, applicants must indicate the eligible expenses related to the project. Make sure that the project covers the full amount of the funding. Therefore, the full amount of the funding that you have applied for and all budget roles, of course, must be engaged throughout the period of funding from April 1st, 2020 to June 30th, 2022. As you see, it's retroactive to April 1st, 2020. All the amounts must be spent within this period of time for the two funding cycles. Yes, there are two cycles, and the first cycle starts March 9th and at 5 p.m. And the decisions will be made as of March 10th, and all the applicants will receive their results from now till April 30th, 2021. And so for cycle two, the portal link will be opened on May 14th, 2021 to end June 25th. Applicants uh, of whom the application was not retained during cycle one may file another application during cycle two without being ensured funding, of course, and the decisions will be made as of uh, June 26th, and everybody will receive their answer um, all the way to August 13th for cycle two. I'd like to point out as well that for applicants located within the province of Quebec, now pursuant to the applicable laws in Quebec, all municipalities or public organizations selected for funding is subject to the Act on the Executive Municipal Council. And so the applicants may file their application without receiving an authorization, and applicants retained will have to obtain a separate approval and authorization prior to funding being released. So you may apply, but you must obtain authorization for funding to be released. I'm checking the questions. Will several projects be eligible within the same municipality? If so, organizations, let me see, organizations may be competing with the cities. And indeed, this is something that must be avoided. Now I'm going to ask Sally to perhaps add something on this. I think for specific situations such as the one you've described, we'd like the applications or the applicants to email us, and our email link or address is in the chat box because it's going to be difficult to know how to initiate an application in given situations. There are many eligible eligibility requirements. Now, I see a question that could be intended for Jean-Philippe in the chat box. It's a list, and I'll allow you to continue. And Ms. Sabarini is asking the question on the role of a mobilization agent. And may I direct it to Jean-Philippe? And she wrote in the chat, could you please specify the role of a mobilization agent or the team, what these people do? I know you sort of addressed that, but could you please revisit that? Yes, in fact, these are the key players. The mobilization team or agent will hold a very important role throughout the three steps of the project and the design. In terms of the participatory design, will manage mobilization of the organization in connection with the project lead if there's several organizations to involve or to set in place for the project. In the day-to-day, when the project is launched, then the presence on site, on the premises, if there are activities, and also to manage the evaluation of the project. This person will often conduct uh, questionnaires, will hand them out, make observations out in the field, greet, welcome the artists or the organizations who will make presentations or hold projects on the public space. It's the image of the project and a public space. It's the key main resource person for all steps. And of course, I see this person as a key resource, a key person, and we can delve into the detail of the role of this team, of this person within each of the steps. But I would say that this person or this team is involved in each of these steps, especially in terms of mobilization of an organization. And the continuous mobilization activity is a primary role of an agent. You turn to the organizations that you're working with and the citizens that will also occupy the public space you will have created and who will remain mobilized and who will be acquainted with the project and will also provide information to adequately use this space. And so it's going to be continuous. And it's the the team that is the most important, the project lead and mobilization team. Thank you very much, Jean-Philippe. I'd like to continue, Jean-Philippe. There's a question for those interested in sustainable mobility in the broader sense of the term for other project types and for street redesigning that could be eligible for this type of project. There's a question, what other type of projects are we talking about? Good question. In fact, I I would use my mirror to send it back to Catherine. And I know that there were people in the chat, and now it's myself. I'm not too sure if they're from a local organization or whatever, but I know that there are foundation people who'll be able to answer the question. But I would like to refer, of course, we can talk to you about sustainable mobilization in general, but the guide is very eloquent and most especially as of page 8 in French for all the examples of mobility. And so we are focused, rather focused on what we are working on, but in here you have creating accessible winter installations available to users and also to create designs, intersection designs, and there are various examples in the applicant's guide. And so I can leave it to my colleague to complete the presentation. Yes, Sally. Yes, I was in the background. I wasn't able to hear the question. Could you briefly repeat the question? Yes. Are there other project examples, if you will, other than street redesigning of road streets that we could find or come up with? Yes, I would say that in the applicant's guide, there are plenty of examples of eligible projects and redesigning roads, streets, or public installations in parks and installing Wi-Fi access in public spaces or public zones. These are all eligible projects that also are relevant and are eligible and will remain with you if you will allow me. Sally, we have a question here. Must we have complete design plans prior to filing our application? Good question. No, not necessarily, but it's suggested, it's recommended. And so, of course, to encourage approval, we want as much information as possible. If you include all of the possible documents in your application will be excellent. It's not 100% necessary to file your application, but we'd really like to see as much information as possible. Excellent. Thank you, Sally. Yes, Michelle, go ahead. And I may add a little bit. Hello, everybody. I'm Michelle. And forgive my French, firstly. And applicants must show that they've done a little research to obtain a permit and also to have the highest chances, the strongest chances of getting funding for the project. And the applicant must show that at a and has initiated the process to a certain point. So if a permit is required, we need to have it before the funding is released. And as my colleague said initially, it's just to show us that one must know what to do to obtain that permit. And deep down, Michelle, if you'll allow me, it's to ensure that all the stakeholders agree and give their approval if proposing a project tied to a municipality or any partner to show that indeed the permits or the required approvals, authorizations are granted, and before releasing the funds. Of course, we'll need physical evidence of this. Excellent. I'm also asked, will school grounds be considered public spaces? Well, listen, if the grounds are open to all the community members, it means that it's a space that's open to the public and will be considered as a public space. If not open to all, then it'll be considered to be a private property and will not be eligible for funding for this community health uh, or community health community initiative. And so for the percentage of the funding to be provided, the funding may range from 0 to 100% if the application is really tied to efforts uh, stemming from COVID casualty. And of course, it can go all the way up to 100%. And listen, honestly, we hope to have answered all of your questions. And please feel free, do not hesitate to visit the CHCI website to obtain further information. And we invite you to answer these two questions, part of a survey, before you leave us, to help us ensure and to help us improve our presentations. And we hope that this presentation was very helpful. I wish to thank Catherine and Jean-Philippe from Vivre-en-Ville, Michel, Jacqueline from CFC. Thank you very much, all of you, and have a good rest of the day and good luck.